Everyone laughed when Mason Vale, a single father delivering groceries to pay his light bill, knelt beside the wheelchair of billionaire Alexandra Blackwood. For 17 years, every doctor in Boston had told her that her legs would never answer her again, and she had built an empire while sitting perfectly still in a machine that was supposed to be her salvation. Mason only looked at the control panel for a few seconds before he asked a question that silenced the entire room, wanting to know who had reversed the sensor readings on her chair. Security dragged him toward the door, but his hand found a hidden switch before they could pull him away, and the support frame shuddered awake. Alexandra gripped the rail with both hands, and slowly, impossibly, she began to rise. If you want to know how an unemployed engineer noticed what an entire medical establishment had missed for almost 2 decades, stay until the end and press subscribe so you never miss what happens next. Rain hammered the windshield of Mason's aging sedan as he pulled up outside the Blackwood estate, checking the delivery address twice, because no other driver on his route wanted the job. The dinner that night brought together the leadership of Blackwood Dominion Holdings and the executives of Ashcroft Neural Systems, a closed meeting worth billions of dollars, and none of the catering staff had wanted to navigate the estate's private security for a single grocery run. Mason took the order anyway, because his daughter Tessa needed her inhaler refilled, and the electric bill was due before sunrise, and pride had stopped being a currency he could afford months earlier. He arrived soaked through his jacket, his boots caked with mud from the long gravel driveway, carrying 2 heavy paper bags toward a house larger than any building he had worked in during his engineering career. A housekeeper directed him toward the service entrance without making eye contact, and Mason accepted the instruction the way he accepted most things now, without argument, because arguments cost time he did not have. Preston Hawthorne noticed him crossing the main hallway with the bags and remarked loudly to the room that nobody should let the delivery man near anything worth more than his car, and several executives laughed on cue. Mason said nothing, set the bags on the marble counter exactly where he had been told, and turned to leave before his presence became any more of a spectacle than it already was. On his way out, Mason passed close to the wheelchair where Alexandra Blackwood sat reviewing a contract, and something in the machine caught his attention before he even understood why. He heard a relay click twice instead of once, a small mechanical stutter buried under the low hum of the motor housing near her right leg, the kind of sound an engineer trains himself never to ignore. A warning light near the base flickered in a pattern that contradicted the direction her torso was leaning, and the display above her armrest flashed a spasticity alert, even though her legs had not moved at all. Mason lingered a beat too long, and Preston asked sharply what a delivery driver thought he was looking at, prompting another wave of laughter from the assembled guests. Mason answered plainly that the machine appeared to be reading her movement backward, a sentence delivered without theater or apology, which only made the room laugh harder at his expense. Conrad Ashcroft crossed the room with the easy authority of a man who had spent 30 years building a reputation, glanced at Mason's uniform, and told him that he had studied the nervous system for longer than Mason had known how to drive a delivery van. Before Mason could respond, Alexandra's chair let out a sharp mechanical alarm and locked every joint at once, freezing her mid-motion in front of everyone in the room. Alexandra's torso jerked forward as the backrest angle shifted without warning, and the stimulation system kept firing pulses into her legs even after she demanded that someone shut it down. Her personal nurse fumbled with the control panel, but the interface had frozen, unresponsive to every command she entered, while Alexandra's breathing grew shallow with a panic she refused to show on her face. Mason understood immediately that the device had fallen into a corrective loop built on a lie, a sensor reporting a fall to the left, software overcorrecting to the right, Her body pushed further right until the sensor screamed louder and the cycle fed itself into something dangerous. He said, calmly but firmly, that someone needed to cut power to the stimulator before her muscles exhausted themselves fighting a machine that thought it was saving her. Ashcroft ordered security to remove him at once, unwilling to let a stranger touch equipment worth more than most people's houses. But Mason had already begun reciting the exact name of the emergency port hidden beneath the armrest and the reset sequence that followed it. Ashcroft went still, because that information had never been published anywhere, not in a manual, not in a patent filing, not anywhere a delivery driver should reasonably have had access to it. And the stillness on his face lasted just long enough for everyone in the room to notice. Mason explained, without raising his voice, that he had helped design the safety architecture the current system was built on, back when it carried a different name and belonged to a much smaller company that no longer existed under its own banner. With Alexandra's frightened permission, Mason disabled the stimulator, switched the chair into manual mechanical mode, released the locked hip joint, and returned the backrest to its neutral position while asking Dr. Naomi Brooks, newly hired and still finding her footing in the room, to check Alexandra's blood pressure and reflexes. Alexandra's vitals steadied within a minute, her breathing slowing as the machine finally stopped fighting her, and for a moment nobody in the room was laughing anymore. Ashcroft recovered quickly, insisting to the assembled board members that Mason had simply gotten lucky, that any competent technician eventually stumbles onto the right button by accident. On the drive home, the truth of Mason's history settled uneasily behind his eyes, a story he rarely told anyone anymore. He had once been a respected lead engineer at a small mobility company called Novus Mobility until a much larger firm acquired it and quietly erased his name and his team from every product record that followed. He had lost his most recent engineering position 8 months earlier after refusing to sign a safety certification for a device he believed was not ready, a decision that cost him his career and left him delivering groceries to keep his daughter Tessa insured after her mother's death 4 years earlier. In the months after that firing, Mason had applied to nearly every engineering firm within driving distance, watching each rejection arrive with the same polite, empty language, and slowly he had stopped mentioning his old title at all, because saying it out loud only made the silence that followed feel heavier. He kept his old certifications in a drawer beside his bed, not because he expected to use them again, but because throwing them away had always felt like admitting something he was not ready to admit. Tessa never complained about the smaller apartment or the second-hand car, and her quiet acceptance of their reduced circumstances was somehow harder for Mason to carry than any complaint would have been. He told himself most nights that competence did not disappear simply because nobody was willing to pay for it anymore, even on the evenings when he found that harder to believe than others. As he reached for his car door, an assistant caught up to him breathless, saying Alexandra wanted him to come back inside immediately because she had one question she needed answered before he left. She did not thank him and did not soften her voice with any pretense of warmth, asking instead what exactly he had seen that none of her own doctors had ever noticed in 17 years of appointments. Mason told her honestly that he did not believe they had failed to see it, but that somewhere along the way, someone had decided it was not worth looking at closely. Alexandra studied him for a long moment, the kind of look she rarely gave anyone outside her boardroom, and asked him to review the complete operating history of her chair before he left the estate that night. Ashcroft objected immediately, arguing that a delivery driver had no business examining confidential medical technology, his tone sharper than it had been all evening. The intensity of his objection struck Alexandra as strange, and for the first time in a decade of trusting the same physician completely, a small thread of doubt began to unravel inside her. She agreed to let Mason examine the records under strict supervision, setting conditions of her own before he touched a single file, determined that whatever came next would happen on her terms and not his. Mason accepted only after laying out 3 conditions of his own, insisting that Naomi supervise anything involving Alexandra's body directly, that no attempt to stand occur without a full medical evaluation first, and that every byte of data be copied to an independent server outside the company's control. Preston mocked him for negotiating terms with a billionaire, as though he had any leverage at all, but Alexandra silenced the room by pointing out that the man who had just kept the chair from crushing her ribs had earned the right to set a few conditions. Reviewing months of sensor logs, Mason found that every time Alexandra attempted to activate her thigh muscles, the system logged the effort as an involuntary spasm and immediately fired an inhibitory signal to suppress it, treating her deliberate intention as a malfunction to be corrected rather than a message to be understood. The left and right channel data showed signs of having been swapped years earlier, a subtle wiring error buried so deep in the calibration history that nobody without Mason's specific background would have thought to question it. He asked Alexandra whether she had ever felt her legs try to move, only to feel them grow heavier a moment later, and she went quiet for longer than anyone expected before admitting that the sensation had happened hundreds of times over the years. Every specialist she consulted had told her the feeling was nothing more than muscle memory or wishful thinking, phantom signals from a body trying to remember what it used to do, and she had eventually stopped mentioning it because the explanations always sounded the same. Ashcroft insisted that Alexandra's spinal injury was too severe to produce any intentional movement whatsoever, his tone patient in the way of a man used to being believed without question. Mason did not argue about the diagnosis itself, asking instead why a system with no signal to suppress would need to fire a correcting pulse so consistently and so often. Ashcroft had no answer that satisfied the question, and he pivoted instead to demanding the review end immediately, reminding everyone that Mason held no medical license and had no business making claims about a patient's condition. Mason agreed that he was not a physician and clarified that he was only examining the machine, not diagnosing the woman sitting in it, a distinction that Naomi quietly noted deserved serious attention rather than dismissal. Naomi asked Alexandra to simply imagine straightening her knee without activating any assistance device at all, watching the monitor for anything the untouched sensors might register on their own. A faint but consistent signal appeared each time Alexandra repeated the intention, small and imperfect but undeniably responsive to her will. Mason then swapped the 2 sensor channels within the simulation software alone, without touching Alexandra's body in any way, and the readings immediately began making physiological sense for the first time in years. Alexandra did not celebrate the discovery, and instead she grew angry, because if Mason was right, she had spent years being convinced that every genuine sensation in her body was nothing more than imagination. She demanded to know whether this meant she could walk again, and Mason refused to promise her anything he could not verify, telling her honestly that he did not know how far her body could go, but that the machine she trusted had never once given her an honest chance to find out. Naomi located an old archived report from 11 years earlier showing a nearly identical motor signal, filed and then dismissed within days as sensor noise not worth pursuing further. The physician who had signed off on burying that report was Conrad Ashcroft himself, a detail that none of them said aloud yet, though the weight of it settled over the room like a held breath. Alexandra insisted on attempting to stand that same night, unwilling to wait even a single day longer than she already had, her voice carrying an urgency and a rawness none of them had ever seen from her before. Naomi pushed back hard, listing every risk involved, from years of muscle atrophy to sudden drops in blood pressure to joints that had not borne weight in nearly 2 decades. And Mason surprised Alexandra by siding completely with the physician's caution rather than her own impatience. After a full medical evaluation and the preparation of a proper support frame, they agreed to attempt only a brief, carefully controlled trial, disabling the automatic inhibition algorithm, recalibrating the 2 swapped sensors, reducing stimulation output to the safest possible level, and rigging a weight relief harness with 2 therapy specialists standing close on either side. Preston and several executives stayed to watch, certain they were about to witness Mason humiliate himself in front of people whose opinions actually mattered. Mason knelt beside the frame, checking every locking point without acknowledging the mockery aimed at him, focused entirely on the woman he was trying to help stand safely rather than the men waiting for him to fail. He told Alexandra not to force anything, asking her only to attempt the exact motion she had imagined 1,000 times over 17 years, nothing more and nothing less. The device registered her signal, her knee extended, and her body began to rise slowly from the chair. Most of her weight still carried by the harness at first, but within seconds the monitor showed her legs bearing real, measurable load of their own. Alexandra stood upright for roughly 12 seconds, not walking, not cured, but for the first time in 17 years, participating in the act of standing instead of being lifted by a machine that had spent years working against her. The room fell into complete silence, broken only by Naomi's quiet tears as she kept her eyes locked on the monitor rather than the moment itself, unwilling to let emotion distract her from vital signs that still needed watching. Beatrice Blackwood gripped the edge of a nearby table to steady herself, and Preston's wine glass slipped from his hand and shattered against the marble floor without anyone bothering to look at it. Ashcroft did not look at Alexandra at all, staring instead at the data streaming across the monitor as though he were watching the foundation of his own empire begin to crack open in real time. When they lowered her carefully back into the chair, Alexandra did not cry immediately, studying Mason's face for a long moment before asking whether he had known for certain this would happen. He told her the truth, that he had not known, only that she deserved the chance to try with a machine that was not fighting against her own body. That single sentence broke through something in Alexandra she had spent 17 years reinforcing, and for the first time in a very long while, she allowed someone else to see it happen. Unnoticed in the celebration, Preston quietly filmed Mason adjusting the control panel earlier in the evening, and before sunrise the footage had already reached the company's communications department with a headline prepared and waiting. By morning, clips of Alexandra standing had spread across every outlet that covered business and technology news, but the footage had been carefully edited to remove Naomi's medical approval, the safety protocols, Alexandra's clear consent, and the data proving the device had malfunctioned for years. Instead, Mason was portrayed as a desperate delivery driver, a former engineer dismissed for incompetence, a man exploiting a vulnerable billionaire to chase attention and money that were never his to claim. Reporters gathered outside Mason's apartment building within hours, and Tessa had to push through the small crowd just to get inside after school, her father meeting her at the door and immediately arranging for her to stay with her aunt until the noise settled down. Mason wanted to withdraw entirely from the situation to protect his daughter, unwilling to let his mistakes, real or invented, become something she had to carry through hallways at school. Alexandra offered him a formal advisory position with a considerable salary, but Mason refused to sign a contract that would hand every future discovery he made directly to Blackwood Dominion, unwilling to trade one controlling company for another, even one that had just been kind enough to believe him. Alexandra, wounded by what felt like distrust, learned only slowly that Mason's hesitation was not about her personally, but about a lifetime of watching powerful institutions decide what truth was convenient enough to keep. Beatrice and Preston pressed Alexandra hard, warning her that the Ashcroft acquisition sat on the verge of completion, that canceling it could cost the company billions of dollars, and that admitting the device had ever malfunctioned would open the door to lawsuits from every patient who had ever used it. They wanted Alexandra to publicly describe what had happened as nothing more than a mechanical lift, stripping away any suggestion that her own nervous system had been involved at all. Alexandra refused that framing outright, though she still had not found the courage to publicly defend Mason against the accusations swirling around him. Meanwhile, Ashcroft approached Mason privately with an offer that included several $1 million, an honorary title inside his company, the quiet erasure of every negative mark on his professional record, and a guaranteed fund for Tessa's future education. He delivered the offer over coffee in a quiet corner of a downtown hotel, speaking in the calm, reasonable tone of a man who had made this exact kind of proposal before and expected it to work again, framing it not as a bribe but as a fair resolution that would let everyone move forward with dignity intact. In exchange, Mason would need only to confirm that the malfunction had appeared solely in a recent software update, with no connection whatsoever to Alexandra's years of prior treatment. Mason listened to the entire proposal without interrupting, turning the coffee cup slowly in his hands, and when Ashcroft finished speaking, Mason asked him plainly whether the fund for Tessa's education came with an invoice attached, a question that finally cracked the older man's composure for just a moment. Mason realized in that moment that Ashcroft was not afraid of the device having a flaw, but of the world discovering that flaw had existed for years while he chose silence over correction, and he understood that no amount of money could make that particular truth stop being true. That night, Mason quietly noted the exact software version number Ashcroft wanted him to blame publicly, and cross-referencing it against the estate's original data, he discovered the version had only been installed 3 months earlier, while the sensor irregularities themselves stretched back more than a decade. Someone was constructing a convenient lie, and Mason intended to find out exactly who. Working with restored access, Alexandra rewrote his contract entirely, granting Mason full ownership of any methods or discoveries he made, keeping her own medical data under her personal control, arranging for an independent third party to store a complete backup, and explicitly forbidding Blackwood Dominion from silencing any safety concern he chose to raise. It was the first real sign that Alexandra was learning to collaborate rather than simply command, a small shift that mattered more than either of them said aloud. Together with Naomi, they combed through 17 years of treatment history and found 3 troubling anomalies scattered across the timeline, each one buried by the same signature. 11 years earlier, Alexandra had produced a weak but genuine knee extension signal during a routine trial. 7 years earlier, sensors recorded active load bearing when she attempted to stand unassisted. 2 years earlier, a young technician had recommended re-examining how the sensor channels were assigned, only to be quietly transferred to another department before the suggestion went anywhere. Digging deeper into the software architecture, Mason recognized fragments of his own original code buried inside the current system, remnants of the Sentinel Motion core he had designed years earlier for Novus Mobility before its acquisition. His original design included a built-in safeguard requiring the system to halt and demand manual review whenever the body's signals contradicted the sensor readings 3 consecutive times, a fail-safe meant to catch exactly this kind of error before it caused harm. Ashcroft Neural Systems had quietly disabled that safeguard to make the device appear smoother and more reliable during public demonstrations, a cosmetic decision with consequences that had followed Alexandra for years. Had the safeguard remained active, her true condition might have surfaced long before it ever reached a crowded dinner party. Mason spent an entire night tracing the exact date the safeguard had been switched off. Cross-referencing it against an early marketing timeline he found archived in a regulatory filing, and he realized the change had been made only weeks before the company's first major public showcase, a showcase that had gone on to raise a substantial round of investment. It was not a decision made out of malice toward any single patient, he understood, but a small compromise made in service of a smoother presentation, the kind of shortcut that quietly stopped being small the moment a real person's body was attached to the other end of it. He thought about how many other patients might be living inside the same blind spot, trusting sensors that had been tuned for a boardroom rather than a body, and the thought kept him awake long after Alexandra and Naomi had gone home for the night. During the long nights spent reviewing files together, Alexandra began noticing a version of Mason that surprised her. A man who never once used her recovery to boast, who consulted Naomi before proposing anything, who remembered obscure technical figures perfectly but regularly forgot to eat dinner. Mason, in turn, began to see past the composed executive persona to a woman who had spent 17 years surrounded by people convinced they knew better than she did what was good for her own body. A quiet trust grew steadily between them, not rushed and not yet spoken aloud as anything more than respect. A recovered file revealed that Alexandra's genuine motor signal had once been manually reclassified into a folder labeled involuntary reflex, the change made under the login of Ashcroft's former research assistant. That assistant had died 3 years earlier, leaving Ashcroft free to place the blame on someone no longer able to defend himself. Then Mason found something else entirely, an encrypted file simply labeled Blackwood Longitudinal Response, marked with a warning against export, protected by hardware credentials that existed only inside the Central Ashcroft Neural Systems Laboratory. Whatever it contained, someone had gone to enormous lengths to keep it locked away. To settle the growing controversy without further damaging the stock price, the board arranged a formal demonstration under strict conditions, requiring an independent physician, an Ashcroft-appointed specialist, a pre-verified device, and a rule forbidding Mason from touching the control panel once the test began. If Alexandra failed to replicate her earlier movement, the board intended to declare the first event a simple mechanical fluke and close the matter permanently. The night before the demonstration, Mason noticed the software version had changed again. The correct sensor mapping still in place, but the activation threshold quietly raised far beyond what Alexandra's current strength could achieve. System logs showed the change had been made under his own account, even though the physical security key required for that login had never left his pocket. He warned Alexandra immediately, but Preston dismissed the warning as a convenient excuse being planted in advance for an inevitable failure. During the formal trial, Alexandra attempted to stand twice, and both times the device failed to respond, leaving her stranded in silence while the entire board watched. In front of the assembled directors, Ashcroft suggested gently that Alexandra's hope had simply been exploited by an irresponsible stranger with nothing to lose, his voice carrying the practiced sympathy of a man who had spent decades being believed without needing to raise it. Alexandra turned to Mason, waiting for an explanation, and security promptly presented server logs showing his account accessing the system at 3 in the morning, timestamps that made him look like the architect of his own deception. He was accused of manipulating the data to fabricate the first standing event, then sabotaging the follow-up test to shift blame onto Ashcroft entirely, a theory that unraveled into something almost elegant the way Ashcroft's team presented it, complete with charts and a rehearsed timeline. Mason tried to explain that his hardware key had never left his possession, but in a room already primed to distrust him, The explanation sounded like exactly the kind of thing a guilty man would say. Under pressure from the board, Alexandra reluctantly suspended Mason's access pending a full investigation, a corporate decision that made sense on paper but still felt like betrayal to the man standing in front of her. And for a moment, neither of them could find a way to look at the other directly. Security escorted him out past the same executives who had mocked him weeks earlier, and Preston leaned in close enough to whisper that Mason had walked into that house, carrying a grocery bag, and should have remembered exactly where he belonged. Mason said nothing in response, carrying the weight of the accusation home with him in silence. At his apartment, Mason found that Tessa had quietly placed his old toolbox on the kitchen table without saying a word about why. She told him simply that they had taken away his access badge, not the things he actually knew, a small sentence that steadied him more than any lawyer's reassurance could have. Reviewing the accusation again that night, Mason remembered that his account required a physical hardware key to log in from any terminal, and that key had never once left his coat pocket during the entire ordeal. That meant someone with administrative access had rewritten the server logs themselves, and only 3 people in the entire company held that level of authority: Mason, Alexandra, and Conrad Ashcroft. With his own name eliminated by simple logic, the list narrowed itself down to exactly one likely author. Locked out of Blackwood's internal systems, Mason turned instead to public records, digging through old Sentinel patent filings, regulatory submissions Ashcroft had made over the years, documentation from the original acquisition of Novus Mobility, and copies of old correspondence still saved on his personal hard drive. He discovered that Ashcroft's team had reused portions of Mason's original safeguard code while quietly stripping his name from every version of the documentation. Crucially, that original code generated a tamper-resistant timestamp independent of the standard company servers, and that timestamp proved his account had been falsified only after his access had already been revoked, a detail no ordinary log could fake. Around the same time, Naomi discovered that a critical control board inside the demonstration device had been physically swapped out the night before the formal trial. Piecing the evidence together, Alexandra finally understood that Mason had been deliberately set up to fail in front of the people whose trust mattered most. She came to his apartment alone, without an entourage of assistants or a single lawyer trailing behind her, arriving the same way any ordinary person might show up at a friend's door, and she waited outside for several minutes before finally knocking, unsure of what she would say once he opened it. Alexandra apologized for choosing procedure over the man who had told her the truth when almost no one else would, admitting she had let fear of losing control cloud a decision that should have been simple. She told him that for 17 years, she had measured every person around her by how well they managed a crisis for the company, and that she had almost let that same measurement cost her the one person who had never once tried to manage her. Mason did not forgive her immediately, telling her honestly that she had spent too long inside a world where a wealthy person's caution could quietly destroy someone who had no resources to defend himself, and that trust, once shaken that way, did not simply reset because an apology arrived at the right door. Alexandra absorbed the criticism without flinching, understanding that she had earned every word of it, and she stayed standing in his doorway rather than retreating from the discomfort of it, which Mason noticed and quietly respected more than anything she could have said. Mason eventually agreed to return, but only under 3 new conditions: requiring the next demonstration to use equipment verified entirely by an outside laboratory, requiring all data to stream simultaneously to multiple independent servers, and requiring Alexandra herself to speak publicly about what had really happened rather than letting a communications team script the story for her. Alexandra agreed without hesitation. Using her authority as the rightful owner of her own medical data, Beatrice formally demanded that Ashcroft surrender the encrypted Blackwood longitudinal response file. Ashcroft refused outright, insisting the file contained protected trade secrets belonging to his company rather than information about a patient. The idea that a physician would call a woman's own bodily data a trade secret struck Beatrice as deeply wrong, and for the first time she found herself firmly on Alexandra's side of the fight. The board pursued an emergency legal order compelling Ashcroft to release the contents, and within days the file was finally opened for review. It confirmed that Ashcroft had known about Alexandra's genuine motor signal for 11 years, that he feared public confirmation would prove the expensive device was not solely responsible for any improvement she made, that he had ordered the signal repeatedly reclassified as mere reflex, and that Alexandra herself had been used for years as the public face of a patient supposedly fully dependent on his technology. An image that had helped raise billions of dollars from investors who never questioned the story. Facing exposure, Ashcroft called an emergency press conference and claimed instead that Alexandra was being manipulated by Mason because the two of them had developed a personal relationship, an accusation designed to shift the entire narrative away from data and toward scandal. Blackwood Dominion convened a special session before shareholders, regulators, and reporters, where Ashcroft painted Mason as a bitter former employee with no medical credentials, a man exploiting Alexandra's emotions to sabotage a legitimate acquisition for his own future gain. Mason did not deny lacking a medical license, telling the room plainly that he had never diagnosed Alexandra Blackwood, only proven that her machine had been lying to her doctors about what her own body was actually doing. And he reminded the room that every finding he presented had already been verified independently by specialists with credentials no one in that room could dismiss as easily as they had dismissed him. Naomi confirmed that Alexandra's injury was incomplete and that a genuine motor signal remained biologically possible, while an independent laboratory verified that the sensors had been swapped, that the algorithm had fired unnecessary inhibitory pulses for years, that Mason's access logs had been falsified, and that the demonstration hardware had been physically altered before the failed public trial. Beatrice presented the recovered file proving Ashcroft had known about Alexandra's response for over a decade, and Mason produced internal messages showing Preston had personally ordered the first video edited and paid a communications firm to damage his reputation, motivated entirely by the enormous bonus tied to the completed acquisition. Several board members who had said nothing throughout the entire ordeal now leaned forward, asking pointed questions about how long leadership had known and why no one had raised the concern sooner, and Beatrice, to her credit, did not shield anyone from the discomfort of answering honestly. One elderly director, who had sat on the board since before Alexandra's accident, admitted quietly that the company had grown too comfortable treating her recovery as a story to be managed rather than a life to be respected, a statement that seemed to land harder on the room than any of the technical evidence had. The board suspended Preston on the spot, revoked his standing bonus package, and opened a formal review of every decision he had authorized during the crisis, while the room fell into a stunned quiet that no one bothered to fill. Alexandra rose to address the room herself, refusing to let anyone else script her words any longer. She told them plainly that she had not been cured, that Mason had never promised her a normal, unassisted life, that her first moment standing had never been a miracle, only the result of a genuine signal that had been ignored for years inside a system built to suppress it. Turning a person's body into a marketing symbol without telling the full truth, she said, was nothing short of betrayal, and she formally announced the cancellation of the Ashcroft Neural Systems acquisition in front of everyone present. Under Naomi's close supervision, Alexandra entered a support frame that had been independently certified only days earlier, with Mason standing several steps away, deliberately keeping his hands off the control panel this time. She activated the movement using her own signal alone, without assistance from anyone in the room, and stood in front of the entire board on her own initiative. This time she held the position longer, shifting a portion of her weight from one leg to the other, with visible, if imperfect, control, and the room rose to its feet in applause while Mason stayed seated, still watching the safety readouts rather than the spectacle. Alexandra looked toward him and told him quietly that he could stand up now too, because this time nobody in the room was laughing at him. In the weeks that followed, regulators opened a formal investigation into Ashcroft Neural Systems, and Conrad Ashcroft was forced out of his own company while every other patient's data was re-examined for similar irregularities. He faced separate inquiries into data fraud, violations of patient rights, falsified safety records, and the deliberate concealment of a known risk, alongside a growing wave of lawsuits from investors and former patients alike. Preston was terminated outright and stripped of the bonus he had spent years chasing, while Blackwood Dominion established an independent fund dedicated to auditing every mobility device the company had ever financed. Alexandra offered Mason the position of Chief Technology Officer, but he declined, unwilling to place his future back into a system where one signature from a single executive could still decide his fate. Instead, he founded Veil Human Systems, an independent laboratory dedicated to verifying the safety of assistive mobility devices before they ever reached another patient. Blackwood Dominion became its first investor, but only under terms Mason insisted upon himself, keeping full technical control in his own hands, ensuring patient data remained outside any investor's ownership, requiring public disclosure of any serious flaw discovered, and protecting the right of any engineer to refuse certification without fear of retaliation. Over the following months, Alexandra learned to stand using a support frame, took a handful of careful steps inside her therapy room, and continued using her wheelchair for most of daily life. A fact the story never treated as failure or as proof that standing alone measured her worth. What mattered far more was that she finally understood her own body accurately and could set her own goals for recovery instead of accepting someone else's version of what was possible for her. Naomi remained her primary physician throughout the process, refusing to let optimism outrun caution, and the two of them built a slow, honest rhythm of small goals met and occasionally missed, each outcome recorded plainly rather than dressed up for anyone watching. Alexandra found that she preferred this version of progress, unglamorous and unhurried, far more than she had ever expected to. She and Mason did not announce anything publicly during the chaos of the investigation, choosing instead to spend months simply working side by side, meeting outside the office, sharing quiet dinners that had nothing to do with censors or contracts, and slowly building the kind of trust neither of them rushed. Alexandra attended the opening of his laboratory without a single camera crew trailing behind her, standing quietly among the small crowd gathered for the occasion, dressed simply, introducing herself to other guests only by her first name. Tessa appeared one final time, watching her father laugh in a way she had not seen since before her mother passed away. A small, private, unremarkable moment that meant more to her than any headline ever could, and she found herself quietly thinking that whatever else had been taken from their family over the years, this particular ending felt like something earned rather than given. After the ceremony ended, Alexandra practiced standing near a window inside the new laboratory, and Mason offered his hand without pulling her up before she was ready. He asked simply whether she wanted his help, and Alexandra placed her hand in his, telling him this time it was not because she could not stand on her own, but because she no longer wanted to stand alone. She rose with the support of the frame, steady and unhurried, and Mason stood beside her, no longer the delivery driver mocked at the door, no longer merely the man credited with a miracle he never claimed to perform. He was simply the person who had listened to a signal an entire room full of powerful people had chosen to ignore. And in the quiet of that room, that was more than enough for either of them, more than any title or headline had ever managed to be.